Hi, welcome to US History, but interesting. The series where we go through American history connecting with the past by Alan Brinkley chapter by chapter and talk about what the textbook says, what it doesn't say, and why you should care about this history right now in the 21st century. Today, we're covering chapter 10, America's Economic Revolution. Let's get into it. Beginning with chapter 10, the textbook changes the way that it's organized a little bit. Rather than covering everything in chronological order, the next four chapters are basically going to be deep dives into specific aspects of the time period from 1820 to 1860. Right here at the start, I want to make three general comments about this period. First of all, the first half of the 19th century was super disruptive. Basically every aspect of American life was affected, from the economy to politics to family structures and gender roles, the ethnic makeup of the country, even the geography of where people lived and how they moved around. But that brings us to the second point, which is that all of those things affected you in different ways and different amounts depending on who you were, how much money your family had, and where in particular you lived. The final point is that people at this time weren't stupid. They knew full well that they were living through a very chaotic period of history, a feeling that I think all of us can kind of relate to living through the 2020s. My point is that people who lived through this weren't just passive observers. They supported some changes and they opposed others. They formed a bunch of conflicting ideologies and movements that were all designed to make sure that whatever came out on the other side of all this change was something they could actually live with. So that's why this time period is broken out into four separate chapters. Today, we're mostly going to focus on the Industrial Revolution and the associated changes in the North. We'll come back and cover the South, the culture, and the politics in the next three chapters. So the textbook starts this chapter with a list of four conditions that society has to meet in order to undergo industrialization. I think that list is a pretty confusing place to start because it's really difficult to understand all of these systems and how they interact with each other without seeing specific examples of how they work first. So what I'm going to do is boil the list down to four things that you need to make a single factory work, and then later we can worry about how that scales up to cover all of society. At the individual level, the four things you need are technology to make things in the factory, money to build the factory, which is also called capital, people to work the machines, which is called labor, and a market where you can sell the things you make. If you think back to the way that I described capitalism in chapter 8, you can fit those four things pretty neatly into that same cycle. Now, I want to walk you through a specific example about a guy named Francis Cabot Lowell. Normally, I would have a picture on this slide, but Wikipedia doesn't have a portrait of this guy, so what we're going to do is go to Creative Commons and take just the first picture we find when we type in his name. Yeah, that feels right. Francis Cabot Lowell was born in Massachusetts in April of 1775. By the end of that month, the colony of Massachusetts would be in open rebellion against the British Crown. Lowell grew up during the Revolution. He graduated from college while George Washington was president, and then he started a career as one of those wealthy New England merchants we're always talking about. It turned out, though, that this wasn't actually a great time to be a merchant. If you think back to chapter 7, the US actually spent most of the early 1800s dealing with trade restrictions from both Britain and France that gradually escalated into an embargo and eventually the War of 1812. As all of this was playing out, Lowell decided that he needed to find a new line of work. He took a trip to Britain that was theoretically a vacation for his health, but while he was there, he also toured a number of British textile mills. When he returned to the States 2 years later, he began the preparations to build a mill of his own, which brings us back to our list. In terms of technology, Lowell had a sense of how the machines needed to work after his trip to Britain, but he also brought on a mechanic named Paul Moody to actually build the machines for him. In terms of money, Lowell was also in a pretty good position. He was a wealthy merchant, which meant that he had his own money, but it also meant that he knew other wealthy merchants who were also looking for ways to make money that didn't run the risk of conflict with the British Navy. Lowell and his new business partners set up a corporation and sold stock to other New England businessmen, eventually raising $400,000. That may not sound like a lot now, but it was 10 times as much as Samuel Slater's mill had cost to build 20 years earlier. Lowell was more than covered on money. But now, he faced another problem. Who was going to actually work in the mill? Lowell's answer was young women. Now, at first blush, that doesn't make a ton of sense. He was building this factory in rural Massachusetts, a place with a long history of rigidly enforcing traditional gender roles. However, there were workarounds for those gender roles. For example, Samuel Slater had hired entire families, letting women and children do most of the work in the mill, while their husbands and fathers worked in traditionally masculine roles like management or construction. But Lowell wasn't interested in hiring the entire family. Instead, he built dorms around the mills where the women who worked for him would live. In addition to their wages, they would receive close moral supervision from older women. He made a point of building churches around the mills and requiring his workers to attend regularly. All of this served to make the young women's families more comfortable with the idea of their daughters being away from home. It also helped that working with cloth and fabric was already seen as a feminine activity. It would have been way harder to convince New England farmers to hire their daughters out as like blacksmiths or dock workers or something like that. I should also point out that for many of the young women in these communities, this was the best chance they were ever going to get to earn a little money for themselves and gain a little bit of independence. With the tech, the money, and the workers in place, Lowell and his associates were able to build state-of-the-art mills that brought almost the entire textile production process under a single roof. If you imagine the process of getting someone a finished bolt of cloth, the only things that weren't handled inside a Lowell mill were growing the cotton and selling the finished product. But that brings us to the fourth thing that you need to make a factory really work: people to sell your product to. Now, in 1814, when Lowell's first mill was established, it was enough to sell the cloth to New Englanders who lived close enough to receive goods along local roads and rivers. However, this first mill was so profitable that they started expanding the operation basically immediately. Lowell himself would die in 1817, but the corporation outlived him and continued expanding for decades. By 1826, they were able to build an entire city around one group of mills. That city, Lowell, Massachusetts, still actually exists to this day. But the question remained: who was actually going to buy all of the cloth they were making? Conveniently, there was another massive project going on around this time over in New York. Up to this point, the only options for long-distance trade were shipping goods over land in horse-drawn wagons, or shipping goods on the water. Water let you carry way more stuff at the same time, and it was significantly faster, but the issue was that you could only go along the coast or up and down a river. New York's problem was that they wanted to trade with people west of the Appalachians, but there wasn't a river that went all the way there. The solution was simple. If you couldn't find a river, you had to make one. In 1817, the state of New York began construction on a canal stretching 350 miles from Albany to Buffalo to connect the Hudson River, and therefore New York City, to the Great Lakes, specifically Lake Erie. Now, you may imagine that building 350 miles of canal would be a pretty difficult task. And you'd be right. It took them about 8 years to complete the project, but it was so successful that it kicked off a canal building craze across several states. Most of those other canals wound up not really mattering, but there's one that we have to talk about that ran from the Great Lakes down to the Ohio River. This one was important because it meant that you could sail from the Mississippi all the way to New York City. If you remember when we talked about the Louisiana Purchase in Chapter 7, I said that New Orleans was the key to the West, because all of the trade of the Mississippi had to go through that city eventually. Now, that was no longer the case. For people in the Northwest, the major port was now New York, and not New Orleans. But remember the reason that I brought this up originally? We were trying to find someone that Lowell's textile mills could sell to. How was this going to help with that? First of all, canals are way more efficient than roads are. According to the textbook, you could take 67 times as much cargo on a canal and still go 33% faster than you would have gone on a road. That meant it was now easy for textile mills in the Northeast to sell their products to people in the Northwest. The catch was that there really weren't that many people in the Northwest yet. But it turns out that canals actually solved that problem too. I mean, if a canal can move a ton of cargo, then it can also move a ton of human beings. And during this period, millions of people took advantage of that new opportunity. Between 1820 and 1860, Michigan, Iowa, Wisconsin, and Minnesota all became states, and the total population of the Northwest ballooned from just under 800,000 to about 7.8 million. One thing to note here is that almost all of the people who moved to the Northwest at this time were white. The Missouri Compromise had marked this land as free territory, and for many Americans, a state without slavery also ideally meant a state without black people. Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois all passed what are called black laws, designed to limit black migration to the area and black civil rights once they got there. For example, most states in the Northwest required black people to post bond with local law enforcement as soon as they entered the state. If you were black, this not only increased the cost of moving to the region, it also meant that the sheriff was automatically watching you from the very moment you showed up. Now, most of the Americans who settled in the Northwest were farmers. They tended to own their own land, averaging 200 acres per farm. As you can imagine, with farms that big, the people were spread out across larger distances than what we're about to see back east. The cultural life of these rural communities was often built around churches, but also secular events like barn raisings, quilting bees, and things like that. Because the soil of the Northwest was so fertile, the region quickly started producing surpluses of agricultural goods. These surpluses only increased over time as more people moved to the region and new technologies like automatic reapers and threshers improved productivity. The same canals that brought people and manufactured goods into the region also carried those massive agricultural surpluses back the opposite direction. In the Northeast, this lowered the cost of food, which was great if you lived in the city and you were looking to buy food. However, if you were a farmer and you were trying to grow your own food and then sell the excess, this was actually bad news. Farmers in places like New England just couldn't compete with the cheap grains flowing in from the West. Some adapted by producing things like fresh fruits and dairy products that couldn't be shipped in from the Northwest before they spoiled, but many others left their farms and moved into the cities in hopes of finding work. This caused massive population growth in those cities. Your textbook tells us that between 1820 and 1840, the fraction of Americans who lived in cities went from 1 in 20 to 1 in 12, and things only sped up during the 40s and 50s. New York and Philadelphia more than doubled in size during those 2 decades, and Boston nearly doubled as well. By 1860, 26% of people in the Free States lived in cities or towns, compared to only 14% in 1840. This urbanization was the fastest in the Northeast. But at the same time, westward migration and trade fueled the rise of western cities like St. Louis, Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, and Louisville. The Erie Canal also spurred the growth of ports on the Great Lakes like Cleveland, Detroit, and Chicago. In the South, there was significantly less urbanization. Although cities like Baltimore grew and developed industrial capacity, most of the South remained rural and agricultural. By 1860, only 10% of the Southern population lived in cities or towns, less than half of the fraction in the North. Now, in order to talk about what life was like in these cities, we have to lay 2 important pieces of groundwork. First off, people in general were earning more money in this period than they used to, but wealthy people were seeing their incomes increase significantly faster than everyone else was. If you think back to that capitalist cycle from Chapter 8, this makes sense, right? Rich people had enough money to start using that cycle to spiral their own wealth up and up and up. Poor people, on the other hand, were mostly only earning enough to meet their basic needs, and they didn't come into this period with substantial wealth like Francis Cabot Lowell had. As a result, they generally didn't get to take advantage of the full wealth-generating potential of the growing capitalist economy. This growing economic inequality combined with urbanization in a kind of interesting way. People were drawn closer together by urbanization, but they were pushed further apart by inequality. Historian Walter Licht describes the result as cities that were laid out in a series of larger and larger rings, with the poorer classes crowded in the middle rings, what today we might call the inner city, and the wealthier classes expanding into the outermost rings, what we might call the suburbs. But that brings us to the second piece of groundwork that I need to lay here. You see, the textbook uses the word class and sort of just assumes that you can get the gist of it from context clues. I have also done that in previous episodes of this series, but this is about to become pretty central to what we're talking about, so I think it's worth taking a couple of minutes to explain what class is and why it's a useful way to think about how society is organized. For our purposes today, there are sort of 2 different types of class: social class and economic class. We're going to start with social class. When the first European colonists came to what is now the United States, they were coming from societies where your social class identity was mostly determined by who your parents were. If your parents were part of the nobility, then you were a noble too. If your parents were peasants, you were a peasant. Being born as part of the lower social class meant that certain opportunities were closed off to you, either by explicit laws or just by general social customs. You would also be expected to defer to the wishes of anyone who was born into a higher social class. And in general, society viewed your life as less important and less valuable than the life of anyone from a higher social class. During the 1700s, Americans correctly identified the fact that this system is dumb and bad. During the Revolution, and immediately afterwards, it was important to many Americans that their new country eliminate this sort of class distinction entirely. And by the end of Andrew Jackson's term as president, the United States had actually done a lot to follow through on that promise. However, just because the United States didn't have that specific type of class distinction, didn't mean that it didn't have any social class distinctions. Race, slave status, and immigrant status were all determined largely by the circumstances of your birth, and they were all tied to legal and social restrictions that were similar at a high level to what we just talked about for the lower social classes in European society. Now, the second piece of the puzzle is economic class, which is kind of just a question of how much money you have. The only issue here is that we have to define the categories for ourselves. The simplest way to do that is functionally. So, for example, does this person have to work to provide for themselves? If the answer is yes, then they're working class. If the answer is no, and actually they could literally afford to spend 2 years in England just looking at factories if they wanted to, then they're probably upper class. Using these types of functional distinctions, we can think of 19th century America as having basically 4 economic classes. The working class is made up of people who have to work to make a living, and are generally not making a ton more money than what they need to get by right now. This includes people like factory workers, farm laborers who are working on someone else's land, and so on. The upper class is made up of people who don't really have to work to take care of themselves, but often do so that they can increase their wealth. This includes merchants, factory owners, plantation owners in the South, and so on. In between those groups, you have the middle class, which is made up of people who generally do work, but who make enough money that they can save it, invest it, or use it to buy luxury goods. They also generally have more secure employment, making it less risky that they're going to get fired and lose their ability to provide for their family. They were often lawyers, clerks, skilled craftsmen, or sometimes small business owners. Finally, at the very bottom, you have what 19th century people called paupers. These people didn't have enough money to provide for themselves. They often either didn't work, or couldn't find consistent employment, meaning that they had some money sometimes, but not always enough. These people were often widows, orphans, people with disabilities, or working class people who had just lost their jobs. There were some opportunities for mobility between these economic classes, but in general, it took a generation or more for people to move their way up the ladder. Most individuals would have lived most of their lives within a single economic class. Now, there's one more point that I want to make about class as a concept before we get back to the specifics of life in the cities and how it differed for different classes. I talked about social class and economic class like they were 2 completely separate things. And they are separate in theory, but in reality, they're actually deeply tied together. Most people who are low on the social class ladder are also low on the economic one, and most people who are high on the economic ladder are also high on the social one. However, these systems were flexible enough that they did diverge sometimes. For example, some free native-born white people were paupers. At the same time, a few free black people were able to work their way up to a borderline middle-class status. I wanted to point this out because it highlights the complexity that you get when different systems interact with each other. Sometimes, someone can be better off than someone else in one class system, but worse off than that same person in the other one, and it's only by understanding both systems that we can really sort that out. Okay, so with all of that out of the way, let's get back to the idea that the cities were laid out in rings. Let's run through those rings, starting with the wealthier ones on the edge of the city and moving inward. The upper classes built mansions, formed elite social clubs, and engaged in conspicuous consumption, which is a fancy way of saying that they bought expensive things to show off how much money they had. An example would be buying a carriage and then riding around town showing everyone how fancy your carriage is. The thing is, in order for that to work, you need a place where you can ride around and be seen. To that end, in 1857, the city of New York developed plans for a park that would rival the ones in European capitals like London and Paris. This would eventually become Central Park. The textbook says, quote, 2 great landscape architects, Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux, developed a vast part of Manhattan, displacing people from their houses in the process. The community they displaced was called Seneca Village. It was made up of about 2/3 free black people and 1/3 Irish immigrants, and it contained about 20% of all the black landowners in the entire city. The people who lived there were not happy about being forced to move. An article in the New York Daily Times from the 1860s describes the beginning of the construction process like this. The supremacy of law was upheld by the policemen's bludgeons and with many broken heads and ensanguined eyes. In the next ring, we find middle-class people. I mentioned previously that some of these people were small business owners, and I want to dig into that really quickly. You see, a lot of American industrialization was like the example we talked about with Francis Cabot Lowell, where investors pooled huge sums of money and built factories out in the countryside with hundreds or even thousands of employees. Lowell and his associates got the technology and the money together first, and then found a workforce, and then grew as the available market expanded. In places like New York and Philadelphia, on the other hand, the market was already there in the form of 2 of the largest cities in the country, and the labor was already there in pre-existing communities of skilled craftsmen. New technology in this period made it easier for craftsmen to scale up their existing operations, not by raising money from rich investors, but by investing their own profits back into their businesses over the course of decades. Because of this pattern of industrialization, by 1860, the average manufacturing firm in Philadelphia only had a total of 8 employees, a far cry from the thousands of women and men working in Lowell mills. These small business owners and their fellow middle-class citizens tended to own their own homes like the upper class did, but the size and splendor of those homes would have been significantly less. Like the upper class, the middle class also formed a ton of organizations, but rather than just being social clubs, many of these middle-class organizations were actually built around social reform movements like feminism, temperance, prison reform, and most importantly, the movement to abolish slavery. Remember when I talked about how different people reacted differently to all the change during this period? Well, these reform movements were some of the ways middle-class people responded. This was near the end of the Second Great Awakening, and for many of these people, their Christianity told them that the country could literally be saved through the hard work of people who were devoted to fixing its most glaring problems. From there, we should move on to the innermost rings of the city and talk about the working class. And this is where we really start to see a massive gap between the different economic classes of society. Where most middle and upper class families owned their own homes, it was becoming increasingly common for the working class to rent instead. While education was becoming more common and more available in general, this wasn't always true for urban working class families. Walter Licht describes the situation as follows. The only way for these families to survive was to have 2 and 3 extra breadwinners in the labor market, which meant the employment of older sons and daughters. And in fact, despite the growth of public school facilities, the 19th century would witness progressive increases in teenage participation in the labor force, particularly those teenagers from families whose fathers occupied jobs on the lower end of the occupational scale. While upper-class teenagers were reading Plato and riding around Central Park in their parents' carriages, working-class teenagers often already had jobs in factories, which your textbook says were becoming large, noisy, unsanitary, and often dangerous places to work. It was common for these jobs to make you work 12 hours a day or more. And I should note that if the idea of entering those work conditions for the rest of your life as a teenager makes you uncomfortable, you should remember that there were actually situations in which children started working in the factory alongside their families as young as 4 or 5 years old. I'll wrap up with one final quote from Walter Licht. The expansion of market activity, the extension of the wage labor system, mechanization, and the building of factories had created a growing tier of new, low-paid positions, jobs often filled by women, children, and immigrants. The bottom had swelled, and people at the bottom now formed a visible mass in the core of American cities and many other communities. It was the glaringness of the inequalities, not the discrepancies themselves, that was new. Now, at this point, you should be asking yourself a question. It seems like working class people were clearly getting the short end of the stick here. So what were they trying to do about it? Well, as far back as the 1760s, craftsmen in big cities like New York and Philadelphia had occasionally organized strikes, which at a very simple level just means that the workers would walk out and refuse to go back to work until the bosses agreed to do something like raising their wages. In the early days, these strikes were generally not super successful. But in 1794, the shoemakers of Philadelphia created the nation's first trade union. Trade unions do a lot of things, but one of the most important is organizing strikes, which can make them way more likely to actually succeed. Now, all of this early labor organizing kind of died out during the economic turmoil around the War of 1812 and the Panic of 1819. However, as industrialization started to take off in the 20s and 30s, a new wave of labor organizers took up the mantle. In 1827, a shoemaker named William Highton created the nation's first federated body of unions, an organization of multiple unions from different industries that agreed to work together. They created their own newspaper to advocate for the working class, and they even created their own local political party, the Working Men's Party of Philadelphia. Then, in 1835, the workers organized a general strike, meaning that they shut down basically all work in the entire city. About 20,000 people walked off the job at a time when the entire population of Philadelphia was only like 80 or 90,000. After a few weeks of this, their bosses gave in to the workers' main demand, which was reducing the length of the working day from 12 hours down to 10. This wasn't the only labor organizing that was going on at this time, though. You see, all of the unions that I talked about in Philadelphia were basically just men, but nationwide in the 1830s, women made up over a third of the industrial workforce, and in the textile industry, that number was about 80%. Just like male industrial workers, the women knew that their conditions were unacceptable, and they organized to do something about it. In 1834, female workers in Lowell, Massachusetts struck to protest reduced wages, but didn't succeed. In 1836, they learned that the factory owners intended to increase the cost of room and board in the company's boarding houses that all of them lived in. The workers struck again, and this time they won, preventing their bosses from raising their cost of living. By 1845, a woman named Sarah Bagley formed an organization called the Lowell Female Labor Reform Association. Like the labor unions in Philadelphia, the LFLRA had its own newspaper. Unlike the unions in Philadelphia, the LFLRA turned to the state government for help, sending thousands of signatures on petitions to ask the legislature to limit the working day to 10 hours statewide. Massachusetts did not oblige. So ultimately, you can see that industrial workers didn't just accept poor working conditions as if they were a given. They worked to make their situation better, albeit with mixed results. One lasting result was free labor, a political ideology which strongly opposed the expansion of slavery into new states. This was based in part on moral arguments that slavery was incompatible with American ideals of liberty, but it also had a strong economic component. In the long run, enslaved labor would just always be cheaper than paying free white people a living wage to do the same job. Free labor advocates feared that if slavery was allowed to expand, it would suck up all of the jobs that could have otherwise gone to the white working class. Toward the end of this period, American labor movements sort of collapsed. One reason for that was the Panic of 1837. A lot of people lost their jobs, and it's way harder to organize a union when all of the members of that union just got fired. Another major issue for the unions, though, was that they couldn't actually unite all of the workers because they often explicitly refused to admit women or black people into their ranks. In fact, Frederick Douglass tells a story about working in a shipyard in Baltimore in the 1830s where white workers went on strike for the specific purpose of getting their free black coworkers fired. If you think about this in terms of the class systems that we talked about earlier, you can imagine that those people were pretty similar in terms of economic class, since they were all doing similar jobs for the same employer. However, the massive difference in social class made them see each other as enemies rather than teammates. This exclusionary mindset went from being a problem to being a fatal flaw in the 1840s and 50s when the unions extended it to Irish immigrants as well. See, immigration had been going on for centuries, but in this period, it really started to take off. Your textbook includes some data about this increase, but for reasons that I really can't begin to understand, it chooses to spread that data out across two separate graphs on two different pages. I went ahead and put those two graphs together for you so that you can actually see what's happening. So, there are two things that you should notice here. First, between the early 20s and the late 50s, the number of immigrants coming into the country got something like 20 times as large. In that same period, the total US population only got 3 or 4 times larger, meaning that immigration accounted for a larger percentage of population growth over time. The second thing you should notice is that there was a big spike in immigration in the late 40s and early 50s. To understand why that happened, we have to talk about the countries these people were coming from. England and Northern Europe were still big contributors, and this period actually saw some of the first immigrants come from China to California, which we'll talk about in Chapter 13. However, the two biggest sources of immigration in this period were Germany, which accounted for about a quarter of the total, and Ireland, which accounted for about 40 to 45% of the total. Both of those countries had major events that drove emigration to the US, and the specifics of those events led to very different situations for the immigrants once they actually got here. I'll link to some videos in the description that cover these events in more detail, but for now, let's do a high-level overview, and let's start with Germany. At this time, there was no single country that was called Germany. Instead, there were two big countries and a bunch of smaller kingdoms that were sort of loosely connected to each other. In 1848, there was a series of revolutions in these smaller countries that sought to unify Germany under a single liberal democratic government. When these revolutions failed, a ton of the people who had supported the revolutions chose to leave Europe entirely, either because they were looking for somewhere that was more closely aligned with their political beliefs, or because they were afraid that the governments that had put down their revolutions were going to try to punish them. As a result, many German immigrants had some money when they came over. They were often educated, many of them skilled craftsmen, and they tended to support liberal political movements like the movement to abolish slavery. Many of them settled in cities on the East Coast, but a ton also settled in places like the Midwest and Central Texas, establishing German communities in their new country. The situation in Ireland was totally different. Ireland's rural poor depended almost entirely on potato farming. In 1845, a new type of mold began infecting potatoes across the country. The resulting crop failures caused a multi-year famine that absolutely devastated the country. Out of Ireland's 1844 population of 8.4 million, about 1 million people died, and perhaps as many as 2 million others left the country, many of them heading for the United States. With that in mind, you can imagine that the Irish people arriving in the US were in a very different situation than their German counterparts. They often had no money, no particular work experience outside of farm labor, and many of them didn't have families that they could lean on for support. They were often single men or women who didn't have any prospects back home and were looking for an opportunity in a new country. Since they didn't have the resources to buy land in the West, they usually wound up as part of the working class or as paupers in major port cities like New York. In fact, in the 1850s, almost half of New York City's population was recent immigrants. In St. Louis, Chicago, and Milwaukee, more than half of the population was foreign-born. So, obviously that influx of people was a pretty big change. How did native-born Americans respond to it? Well, large factory owners kind of loved it. They were facing a workforce that was demanding higher wages and shorter hours, and it was getting way more organized about it. For factory owners, immigration provided a large supply of people who weren't members of the union, didn't have context on what the unions were doing, and were desperate enough for money to work in basically whatever conditions they had to in order to make ends meet. In the 1840s and 50s, factories switched to an immigrant workforce instead of a native-born one because it was cheaper and easier to control. At the same time, there was also a very strong reaction in the opposite direction. Disdain for immigrants was nothing new in American history, and this was especially true for the Irish, since Americans had inherited a centuries-old hatred of the Irish from the very first English colonists. These sentiments, combined with a growing immigrant population in the 1840s and 50s, led to the rise of something called Nativism, which your textbook defines as, quote, a defense of native-born people and a hostility to the foreign-born, usually combined with a desire to stop or slow immigration. So, one thing I want to point out about that definition is that it uses the word defense, which implies that the immigrants must have been attacking in some way. That is certainly how nativists viewed things, but we as students of history shouldn't be too quick to accept that framing. Remember that nativists had a specific goal, reducing immigration, and it was way easier for them to get other people on board with that goal if they could convince them that the immigrants were attacking them. So let's take a look at some of the specific things that immigrants were doing that nativists interpreted as attacks. First off, nativists believed that the Irish were socially inferior and would lower the overall quality of American society. They cited the fact that many Irish immigrants lived in slums and poorly maintained shantytowns. The truth was that many Irish immigrants did live in slums, but that had more to do with the fact that they were poor than some kind of inherent inferiority. Secondly, many nativists disliked the fact that some of the German immigrants, and basically all of the Irish immigrants, were Catholic. They believed that allowing a bunch of Catholics to participate in American life and politics was a surefire way to hand control of the country over to the Pope. And to be fair, as soon as these immigrants started coming over, the United States did actually elect an Irish Catholic president, like 120 years later, and they let him be president for almost 3 whole years before someone shot him in the head, so checkmate, Martin Luther. Finally, nativists believed that immigrants were taking jobs away from native-born Americans and lowering the overall wages by being willing to work for so little. This is probably the most reasonable of these concerns, but it could have been counteracted by allowing Irish immigrants to participate in the growing labor movement and continuing to fight for better wages for everyone, including the Irish. Instead, most unions refused to accept the Irish into their ranks, leaving the immigrants to fend for themselves and make deals with factory owners that would undercut union negotiations. So if those are the supposed attacks that immigrants were launching, what were nativists doing to defend their way of life? Well, the first thing they did, which probably shouldn't surprise you by now, was get organized. In the Northeast, where the immigrant population was the highest, they started forming anti-immigration societies like the Native American Party, which was founded in 1845. These types of societies would eventually spread to other regions as well. In 1850, a number of these societies merged to form the Supreme Order of the Star-Spangled Banner, which advocated for, number 1, a ban on Catholics and foreign-born people from holding public office, number 2, more restrictive naturalization laws, meaning that immigrants would have to wait longer before becoming citizens, and number 3, English literacy tests for voting. Remember last time I said that American nationalists thought the only real Americans were white English-speaking Protestants who were born in the United States? You can think of all of these proposed restrictions as trying to make sure that all of the political power in the country would continue to be controlled by real Americans. Now, the Supreme Order of the Star-Spangled Banner was supposed to be a secret. When asked about it, their members were supposed to say, "I know nothing." As a result, they're commonly referred to as the Know-Nothings. They formed a political party called the American Party, which was briefly relevant in 1854 and then sort of fell apart. With that, there's one more order of business for the main body of this video. I said earlier that in order to build a factory, you needed these 4 things. And I said that later I would scale those things up to the level of society. Well, it's later now, so let's talk about society, and let's do that specifically through the lens of railroads. So first on the list is technology. The British had been building railroads since the mid-1820s, but the US didn't get started until about 10 years later. That's actually pretty typical for how technological progress happened early on in this period. The British would develop the first version of something, and then American engineers would copy it, adapt it to their specific situation, and eventually improve on it. There are 2 other important technologies that I should mention here. The first was interchangeable parts. In the old days, each individual component of something like a rifle had to be specifically made for that exact rifle, and it wouldn't fit any other one. Interchangeable parts were precisely standardized so that they could fit into any rifle without special adjustments. This idea would spread from guns to everything from watches to locomotives to sewing machines. It sped up production and allowed the task to be done by people who weren't master craftsmen. That made it easier to scale up the operation without having to give everyone a lifetime's worth of training. The second invention was the coal-powered steam engine. Most of America's early factories were powered by water, and that meant that the factories could really only be built along rivers, and their scale was limited by how powerful that specific river was. With coal power, you could build your factory anywhere, and as long as you could afford enough coal, you could basically scale up indefinitely. This allowed industrial production to spread across broad swaths of the Northeast, and to a lesser extent, the Northwest. This was also obviously a central piece of technology for trains, because they needed a power source that could move with them in a way that a river obviously couldn't. The next thing that we need for industrialization is a market to sell our goods. Earlier, I talked about how canals made it easier to trade across long distances, but railroads had 2 major advantages over canals. First, they made transportation even more cost efficient. Second, canals can only go between 2 bodies of water, but railroads can go wherever they want. In the early days, railroads just connected a few new places to the existing canal network, but as the decades wore on, the United States built up a web of railroad tracks that connected all of the major cities to each other, and even extended west beyond the Mississippi. No canals required. These tracks were concentrated in the Northeast, which had twice as much track per square mile as the Northwest, and 4 times as much track per square mile as the South. On top of that, when telegraphs became commercially viable in 1844, they made communication essentially instantaneous, as long as you and the other person had access to connected telegraph machines. This made it possible to manage train schedules, and also possible to coordinate business activities across the country. That's why the textbook describes the national version of having a market as a transportation and communication system capable of sustaining commerce over a large geographic area. Railroads and telegraphs meant that the entire country could be your market. The next item on my list is labor, which at a societal level the textbook describes as a population large enough both to grow its own food and to provide a surplus workforce for an industrial economy. Think of it like this. Even if people are working in a factory, they have to eat something, and someone has to grow that food. Once society gets to the point where a small number of people can grow all the food the country needs, everyone else is free to work in factories. Railroads helped this process by transporting farmers to the west where they could be super productive, and then transporting their farm produce to the big cities and factory towns in the east so that people there could focus on manufacturing. Finally, we have money, and this one's a bit complicated. Remember how Henry Clay's big thing was that the US government should pay to build a nationwide transportation network? And remember how we only ever talk about Henry Clay in the context of him making a compromise or losing a presidential election? Given that, you can safely assume that the federal government wasn't paying for railroads. But if they weren't, who was? State and local governments contributed some, but that only covered about 30% of the total cost. The real source of money was private investment organized through a corporate structure just like the one Francis Cabot Lowell used. During this period, many states actually passed laws that made it easier to form corporations, so this became an increasingly common way of financing industrial development over time. That's what your textbook means when it says, systems of business organization capable of managing large industrial enterprises, in the place where I just put money. So hopefully with all of that laid out, you can see why I wanted to start with the version on the right instead of coming straight out of the gate with the thing on the left the way the textbook does. And I want to make one final point about railroads. Decades of expansionist policy had left the federal government with a ton of land lying around. And while the government wasn't willing to pay for the railroads directly, it was more than happy to allocate land to the states or the companies that were trying to develop the railroads. By 1860, the federal government had handed out more than 30 million acres to the states, which for context is more land than the entire state of Pennsylvania. And that brings us to the final section, why this matters in the 21st century. Today, I want to start off with a trivia question. There are a bunch of professional sports teams in New York State. Almost all of them are based in or around New York City, including the Mets, the Nets, the Jets, a couple other teams that don't rhyme, which I assume is just an oversight. There is, however, one other major city that has multiple top-tier professional teams. Name that city. Now you can pause the video if you want more time to guess, but I'll go ahead and tell you that the answer is Buffalo, home to the Bills and the Sabres. But what makes them so special that they get to have multiple sports teams? The easy answer is that Buffalo is the next largest city after New York. But why is that? Why do 278,000 Americans live there specifically rather than some other part of the state? To find a clue, we can look at some of the other largest cities in New York. Number 4 is Rochester, number 5 is Syracuse, number 6 is Albany, 9 is Schenectady, and 10 is Utica. Does this map remind you of anything? Those 6 cities all sit along the Erie Canal. That means that in the early 1800s, basically all of the trade and migration between New York City and the growing American Northwest passed through those cities. Some of those people and some of that money stuck around in those cities. They built families and businesses and communities and helped turn those cities eventually into what they are today. I bring all of this up because when you have a history class that covers all of American history, it's pretty rare that you get to focus much on the story of an individual city. There's just too much material to cover to get that detailed. But I think this leaves a gap in our understanding of history. Realistically, the story of your community probably has a more direct impact on your day-to-day life than most of the stuff that we're going to talk about in a series like this one. Why are there only certain types of jobs available in my city? Why do all the rich people live in this part of town and all the poor people live in that part of town? Who built that giant stupid building that I have to drive past every single day on my way to school or work? These are all questions that are worth asking. They're just not going to get addressed in your US history class. So I would encourage you to take a little bit of time and Google the history of your hometown. See why they built the city where they did, see who decided to move there and why and when, see which companies moved in and which ones moved out. But keep a special eye out for mentions of the transportation networks that we talked about in this video. Because it's pretty likely, especially if you live in the western half of the country, that part of the story of your town is, and then they built the railroad. And now hopefully you have the context to make a connection between the story of your hometown and the story of America as a whole. So yeah, that's it for this episode. If you found it helpful, like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. Otherwise, join me next time for Chapter 11, Cotton, Slavery, and the Old South, in which we have to seriously ask ourselves, are we the baddies